بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم. Alhamdulillah. So we're going to delve into Islamophobia, and oops, you're getting me confused already. Bismillah. We're going to look at Islamophobia from an understanding of the grounding that goes into the production of Islamophobia and why the whole process of demonizing Muslims is undertaking place now. But more importantly, who's behind this campaign, both in this country and across the world, with the third aspect of why you should be aware of this, so when you act or attempt to undo Islamophobia, what is the work that is needed? Because one of the worst things to do is actually to act without knowledge. That's why in Sahih al-Bukhari, Bab al-Ilm comes before al-Amal. Right? الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. So Iman, which is knowledge, comes before Amal. So in here we want to get you the knowledge and understanding of this whole Islamophobia campaign to understand how to deal with it and challenge it on a systematic way. And this has to do with Islamophobia, Palestine, and understanding Orientalism. So there are a number of terms in here that I want you to be aware of. Now, I know that many of you have pens to write with, unless you're one of those that have phenomenal memory, where mashallah you could memorize Sahih al-Bukhari just by listening to it. But you need to take notes, otherwise you're going to go out and the only thing you remember that it was a nice slide. So we don't want to be from those who just think how nice the slide was, rather what was the content of it. Now beginning with what is Orientalism? That's a question that we need to understand. It's a regularized manner of writing, vision, and study dominated by ideological biases, meaning that this is a way that people write, people have a vision and a perspective, and these are ideologically constructed lenses by which the writing and the vision takes place. It's constructing an image of the Orient, meaning that the writing is constructed, it's not real. It is not based on research. It's not based on factual evidence. Often these are images that are taken from one period or the other and then replicated, requoted, and transmitted and becomes the representation of the Orient in general. The Orient signifies a system of representation. Right? Important, system of representation. Meaning when I ask you your name, you give me your name, and if I put next to your name a set of representation, that's not you. But when somebody asks, do you know so and so, and I already go and list all the attributes that I constructed about you, that's a representation. That's not who you are. That's not you as an individual. This is the process by which Western thought, in particular, during the early part of the 19th century, beginning with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, Napoleon did not only come to Egypt by military, he brought a whole scientific enterprise. He brought with him scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, philologists, individuals to record Egypt as they saw it. And therefore, when they wrote essentially from a power perspective. They were writing and recording Egypt, not for the Egyptians, but for the French look at the Egyptian from an inferior perspective. Most of what we read today about the Arab and Muslim world can be traced to this era of writing and documenting the Arab and Muslim world. There are two earlier eras of writing in Western thought that we can point to. One is the period of the Crusades, where there were heavy writing about the Arabs and Muslims, and the other was during the period of the Inquisition and the expulsion of Spain, culminating in 1492. These are three periods where the literature that is written about the Arab and Muslim people in general come from those three periods. And they're important for us to understand how it's constructed. The writing constructs a mirror negative image of the West. So the writing essentially have a mirror negative image. So everything positive is described for the West. Everything is negative is attributed to the Muslims. So now we're following some of the debates taking place in Egypt and in Tunisia. Is Islam and democracy, can they be reconciled? Can Muslims be democratic? That's not a new argument, nor it's a new piece of debate. If you looked at those arguments and those writings from that period, it's actually present in there. And that's where this whole notion that Muslims can be democratic, they need to be civilized. And this notion, civilizational discourse, is still with us till today. Concept of latent Orientalism. Latent Orientalism. This is what is unconscious and untouchable in people's mind. For example, you sit and talk to people, they tell you about how Muslims are. So they speak about how Muslims are in terms of their behavior, what they believe, their ideas. They'll tell you about what Muslims in Egypt do, what Muslims in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, even though they have never left Kansas. How did they get to know this latent Orientalism, this latent understanding? Is by means of media and cultural production. You all watch movies. You all watch TV. You all see cartoons. You all see the representation in images in the newspapers. All that creates a depository in the mental set of the mind that it becomes that you know these people because that's what was the repertoire that got you to know these people even though you never saw them. In a similar way, I could give you a whole lecture about Martians even though I have never met one. Right? That's latent Orientalism, and we need to understand it because it also informs latent Islamophobia. Manifest Orientalism is what's acted upon in policy. What's acted upon. It's what's spoken. It's what becomes policy. You need the latent Islamophobia, you need the latent Orientalism in order to formulate policy. And that's why you have to be as active in preventing latent Orientalism, latent representation of Muslims in a movie. You say, like, it's a movie, why don't we just laugh about it? They're just laughing at, so and so. It's only cartoons, why don't you laugh? It's only cartoons, we make cartoons about Jesus, why don't you laugh about cartoons of your prophet? Right? Because in here, what is being done is creating latent Orientalism, latent perspective that informs policy, and therefore becomes a policy that you are an inferior. Now, while the term has a reference to an area as a manner of writing vision, it also replicates or applicable to other parts of the world. For example, when we think of Africa, anytime you have a story about Africa, you have all these frames that come up. The Africans are savages and civilized, killing each other, untrustworthy cheaters, singing and dancing, and buffoons like. That's Orientalism relative to Africa, and it is constructed in order to legitimize colonial discourse with Africa. Africa is the richest continent in the world in terms of resources. All of you who buy gold, you would not have enough gold had it not been for all the gold that is being stolen from Africa. I know for the women, you always want to have a diamond ring. Without the diamonds from Africa, you would not have diamonds. Right? And you name it in terms of the resources. These frames makes it possible for the West to say we're there to civilize the uncivilized. Right? And it's every story, if you just read between the lines, one of these frames comes up time and time again. For example, every time you have a story about Nigeria, they say the most corrupt place in the world. Now, Nigeria, they have corruptions. But the maximum the corruption takes place, maybe they steal $1 billion here or there. I say that in New York, we do that in a weekend. But the framing essentially is about Nigeria, not about us. So we have to be aware of these. In terms of Latin America, drugs, cartels, corruption, no respect for the law, needs U.S. to show them the way. Women are exotic and objectified, illegal immigrants. These frames, every time you speak about Colombia, you think about drug cartels. Even though that we're the #1 consumer of drugs in the world, but we need to do it in order to support our war on drugs. So it's our rationalization for our policy to get the public to think in these frames. Now, Orientalism creates a binary between East and West. If you look, the West is all positive attributes, the East all negative. Creates a binary, meaning it's a black or white understanding. The world is never a binary. It's always multidimensional. And therefore, it's always to escape looking at the world from a binary system. Right? These are attributes that are used. Now, Orientalism and Islam. Orientalism constructs Islam as an irrational belief. That's why every time you read a story from the New York Times, from the French Le Monde, from the Guardian, from CNN, even the most advanced, at the subtext of the discussion is about, can they be rational? Right? Can they really become like us? Like us meaning that separation of church and state from a particular Western notion. Anytime that somebody asks, why Islam can't separate between church and state, essentially is why Islam can't be like Europe. Meaning the modality of comparisons becomes Europe. Whether Muslims want to undertake that process or not is their own business, is their own history, is their own process. But that question itself is saying that Europe is the model that you need to follow, and therefore why you're not like the Europeans. Right? So it's an irrational belief, and there are many statements in there. Violent savages at the gates of civilization. You should never be not confident to say the following. Muslims don't even make it to the playoffs of violence Super Bowl. We don't. We try to crack the top 5, but we never can. Right? It just, if you look at history, from 1492, the Inquisition, right? The killing of Muslims and Jews, the death and destruction of the native population in the Americas, 22 million. The slave period, some estimate puts it at a low of 15 to 20 million to a high of 80 million from Africa that were subject to the slave trade, death and destruction. The European wars, then the First World War and the Second War, the one with the Holocaust. All that is just European history of violence at a mass scale. And don't forget the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs in Japan. We have to struggle just to crack to the top 6th or 7th in terms of violent periods in history. Yet we're always asked the question about violence and how Muslims are savages. Right? Once again, that's a frame relative to Islam and Muslims. Women are submissive and oppressed, and women are exotic objects. That's often the 2 frames that Muslim women are represented in movies, in literature, and as such you need to be aware of how Orientalism and Islam are connected. Now we'll move to Islamophobia. Now these are the ads that Pamela Geller from Atlas Shrugs have been putting on buses and subway stations all over the country. She put it in San Francisco, New York, and other places. In a war between the civilized and the savage, support the civilized man. Right, that's the frame. And then support Israel, defeat jihad. Now she's speaking to a population that is already have latent Islamophobic content in their mind. Right? Because people have been subjugated to a systematic process of negative representation of Islam and Muslims over the period, and therefore it actually resonates with a large number of population. Islamophobia, once again, this is from the 1993 definition. Islamophobia is a closed-mind prejudice against or hatred of Islam and Muslims. We need to distinguish between somebody that has issues and questions about Muslims' actions in any place versus somebody that has prejudice and hatred of Muslims. I say, I have so many problems with Saudi Arabia policy. You could actually sit down and we could talk for almost hours about problems with their policy and so on. But that's my perspective in terms of a state, its policy, and its action. I don't express hatred to the Saudis as individuals or the Muslims as a group. That differentiates a person who has a critique of Islam or Muslim policy versus hatred and prejudice of Muslims as a group, and therefore wants to act against them in that way. Who benefits from Islamophobia? There are forces. Every period have a number of forces that benefit and articulate their policy in relations to the dominant discourse relative to the policies that are being put forth. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was the communists. And therefore, everything was directed at the communists for a particular cluster of interest. For Islamophobia, right-wing forces in Western society. Last Friday, the Austria's election, the Freedom Party, which is a neo-Nazi party, won 22% of the votes in the election. They are the third largest party in the Austrian parliament. Now just remember this, 22%. This is a neo-Nazi group. This is a country that have suffered during Hitler Germany. They were able to win 22% by riding Islamophobic tendencies and campaigning on an Islamophobia agenda. Same thing in France. Le Pen won about 11.5% of the parliamentary votes in France by riding Islamophobic content. Similarly in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, the Netherlands, you go through Europe, you will find that Islamophobia has been used as a vehicle for discredited right-wing groups to emerge and have seats in parliament. In the US, the Tea Party candidates in particular and segments of the Republican Party have utilized Islamophobia in order to come back and assert themselves in the electoral process in this country. Second group is the military-industrial complex. As the Cold War ended, there need to be a new enemy to rationalize a $775 billion military budget yearly. And Islamophobia and the fear and threat of Muslims, even though that none of the Muslim 57 countries constitute any threat on the United States or Europe as a state. Right? So military-industrial complex needs to rationalize this. Extreme Christian groups, Israel advocates, which I will touch on later, and then right-wing clash of civilization advocates that are more of the liberal clash of civilizations individuals who see there's a clash between the Muslim world and the Western world, and therefore they push this. Anti-immigrant groups. Between 2001 and 2012, 2.5 million Latinos have been deported using Islamophobia and the threat of terrorism and threat of Islamic terrorism as a way to deport Latinos into outside of the US to maintain the demographic picture in the US. If it sounds familiar to Israel using demography, in the US using demography against Latinos, and militarizing the border to prevent terrorism, to prevent Muslim terrorists from coming to the US, even though that most Muslims across the world either speak English or French. Therefore, even assuming that somebody wants to come to the US for terrorism, they will come through the Canadian border, not through the Mexican border, because they no habla español, they don't speak Spanish, unless they go for 2 years to study Spanish in Mexico before they go up there. But using Islamophobia as a way to maintain the demography in this country by limiting and sending Latinos out, and then Tea Party supported politicians. Why Islamophobia? I want you to read this quote very clearly and spend a few seconds and minutes to read it. This is one of your preeminent Islamophobe in this country, Daniel Pipes. If you don't know him, you should know him, because he's a person that 24/7 just throws trash and garbage on every Muslim leader and every Muslim organization in this country. Now, Daniel Pipes says, I worry very much from the Jewish point of view that the presence, meaning you in here, the presence, the increased stature that you are in position of influence, whether doctors, lawyers, engineers, store owners, you have stature and affluence, that you actually have resources, and enfranchisement, that you actually are voting, you politically are participating, right? That enfranchisement of American Muslims, you will present true dangers to American Jews in relations to U.S. and questionable support to Israel. So basically he's saying that you in here, meaning all of you in here, constitute for him a threat and a danger for the policy as it has been in the U.S. for the last 50 years. Now, A.M.J. Rosenberg said, who formerly worked for the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, he said about Daniel Pipes and others, they believe that the more acceptance there is of Muslims here at home, meaning the more that people accept you in here, so when you go to Target to shop, nobody is looking at you strangely, they don't think that there are Martians that are attacking Target, or you go and shop for a cup of coffee, nobody thinks, do they drink coffee in the Arab and Muslim world, right? They don't call the police because you're in the park praying. They don't think that you possibly are praying for a bomb to explode. Right? Meaning that the more acceptance there is of Muslims here in this country, right, there is of Muslims here at home, the less reflexive hatred. Meaning when people accept and see you as normal people, that you are actually no different than anyone else. If a nun can wear her hijab, right, and walk and be seen as an honorable, godly person, it should be the same feeling toward a Muslim woman who's wearing the hijab. The only difference is just that none is using a little bit more material. Right? Meaning that the more acceptance of you, the less reflexive hatred. Because at the end of the day, policies are formulated on reflexive hatred. Reflexive hatred meaning that if you die in Afghanistan as Muslims, in Iraq, or other places, Americans would not feel that there are people that are being killed. Why? Because these were the wrong people. So the Islamophobes want to produce reflexive hatred of you in this country, so it could be deployed for policy overseas. So there's a relationship between domestic articulations and overseas. Now, individuals behind Islamophobic discourse. David Horowitz, he runs Front Page magazine. He works heavily on trying to limit public discourse on relations to Israel-Palestine on college campuses. He has something called the Student Bill of Rights, where he wants to legislate balanced view in the classroom by almost trying to force the classroom to have equal time for his perspective, which is basically an unflinching support for Israel to be deployed in the classroom. Right, so that's David Horowitz. If you are on college campus, the Islamofascism Week, right? How many of you heard of Islamofascism Week? Right, you should, if you're on college campus, that's the campaign that David Horowitz run, Islamofascism Week, which says that Islam is the new fascism. And therefore, we need to target Muslim student associations because they're a front to terrorism. Literally, that's the language that David Horowitz uses. Stephen Emerson, the Investigative Project on Terrorism. Stephen Emerson has a report almost on every Muslim leader in this country that puts it out, and then it's replicated in many different websites and replicated and cross-referenced, and it's used by Peter King, Congressman Peter King, for the hearings on the threat of Muslim terrorists at home. Now, most of these personalities, 99% or 90% of them, I would say, they are from the pro-Israel organizations and groupings in this country. The backbone of the Islamophobic production in the United States are coming from the pro-Israel organizations. The backbone of the Islamophobic production in this country is coming from the pro-Israel organization. These are the individuals, and then these are the organizations. Organizations that 24/7 engage in the defamation and producing racism toward Muslims. The smallest of these organizations has $1 million+ budget. The smallest. Right? So you're dealing with a very large infrastructure of Islamophobic production. This is still institutions. Now, 7 foundations contributed $42.6 million from 2001 to 2005 to 5 Islamophobia spreading organizations. So these are the foundations. Most of these foundations essentially are connected to pro-Israel infrastructure in this country. And these 5 individuals are for the most part connected to promoting Israel's position in the United States. I want to direct your attention to David Yerushalmi. Does anybody know David Yerushalmi? Do you know Creeping Sharia? You know Creeping Sharia? Is David Yerushalmi is behind this whole campaign of Creeping Sharia in the United States. He's connected to the settler community in the West Bank. He's a lawyer that's working in 32 different states to put ballot measures and legislative bills to limit what he called Creeping Sharia, to limit Muslims' ability to live their life according to their religious perspectives, and therefore the Creeping Sharia is to limit building of mosques, giving any credence or attention to burial rites. If you want to bury according to Islamic precepts, all those notions is what he's behind. Yet many people don't know what his background, where his funding has come, and what type of campaign and organization is behind him.
And I didn't know that was him, but I know that the person that made the Sharia was also trying to get rid of Quran completely, being sold it in a bookstore.
Yeah, it's a full campaign that he's carrying across the country. They already succeeded in passing the law in Oklahoma, and then CARE, another organization, went to the court, and the court deemed it to be unconstitutional. All right? So these are individuals that are well funded for this campaign. Now, CARE just came out with its own legislating fear, Islamophobia and its impact in the United States. Between 2008 and 2013, 119,662,719 were spent by the Islamophobic organization, 37 core organizations and 32 periphery organizations. Meaning there is a whole systematic campaign directed at you as Muslims. 37 organizations and 32 organizations behind it. You should read the report. It's available online on CARE. Right? You should read it. Take the time to understand what is taking place. It's very critical because it's about you, essentially. Now, setting the narrative. We said, you remember latent Orientalism, and I'm using latent Islamophobia. Setting the narrative by means of documentaries. These 3 documentaries. This documentary was shown by the BBC. How many, I don't want to say positive, how many just neutral documentaries on Islam have we seen in BBC? Maybe 1 in a blue moon. But now you have this, is shown on BBC. Obsession was distributed to 28 million households in Sunday newspaper with a DVD in the newspaper. Third Jihad has been used to train security forces and security organizations in the U.S., organizations that are dealing with counterterrorism. And the people behind these are the same individuals that we saw in the list of the Islamophobes. You will go to many places across the country, and the library discussions are actually showing these. Some Republican clubs in counties are showing these and having a discussion about Islam. Right? It's basically like bringing the KKK, a documentary on the KKK, and have a discussion about Christianity. That's the type of material that is going out there to inform a large number of the American public in order to create the demonization of Islam and Muslims. I'm going to end with this slide and then have questions and answer with you. What are the goals of the Islamophobia campaign? One is demonize Islam. Thus, Muslims who believe in Islam are guilty. And the person said, I have nothing against Muslims, it's just Islam that I have problem with. And I said, yeah, I saw Islam, he was walking down the street, he went to Pete's Coffee. Maybe you could go after him. Meaning that to try to say that I'm not racist, I'm just against Islam. And by criminalizing Islam, if you say I am Muslim and identify Islam, then you're guilty. In a similar way that they did with communism. Communism was deemed to be a crime. And therefore, if you associate with the communist organization or communist group, therefore you're guilty. So that's one. Second, criminalize Islam through link to terrorism. That's why Daniel Pipes, Stephen Emerson, David Horowitz, Frank Gaffney, and all the organizations were angry with Obama when he said that we're only going to use the term terrorism. We're not going to use Islamic terrorism. Because from their perspective, that link has to be established in the framing of the question of terrorism. Which means for us, it's not a very small issue. It's actually a very important issue. When you say Islamic terrorism, every time that terrorism is mentioned, you're actually given an Islamic identity to an illegal act, which is terrorism, and therefore terrorism by itself should not have a religious identity. Right? So that's very important. It's a major conceptualization issue, and it's not a minor issue. Isolate Muslims in the American society. They actually, Islamophobes don't want you to be part of the American society. They want you to be isolated. They want you to be in a silo. They don't want you to talk to anyone. They want you to be afraid and scared that everybody there is against you, even though that is a very committed group that is demonizing you on a systematic way. Marginalize Muslims in civil society. Don't allow them to have presence in civil society. That's why every time somebody from CARE is invited, they complain. Somebody from AMP is invited, they complain. Anyone that represents the Muslims that have a grassroots connection to the community, they complain because they want Zuhdi Jasser to represent the Muslim community, because Zuhdi Jasser actually speaks with the voice of the Islamophobes, but from a Muslim name. So it's very important to understand isolation and then to isolate you from civil society. This would lead to further radicalization among the youth, because some who are isolated, not allowed to have their own space to speak and address their issues, they get to be radicalized because they see that the society is against them. It's a natural process that occurs, and this might lead some to actually engage in violence. If that takes place, then the Islamophobe says, we told you they're violent. And they come out and say, you see, we told you that these people can't be trusted. We told you that these are Martians. And you should trust us to inform you because we know them. You should bring us to train. And you should trust Israel to provide the training because they've been dealing with this terrorism for longer time than us. And that's why Israel becomes integrated into this whole anti-Muslim campaign in the United States, where every police department, including campuses and so on, engage in sending their officers to be trained in Israel in a systematic way. Now, this leaves the question about what you need to do. Because there is nothing, if I presented all this and say, oh, mashallah, alhamdulillah, Ustad Hatem just gave us a good talk, assalamu alaikum. This means that you have to do the serious work. One is that you need to identify who's producing your demonization. Understand who's your enemy and understand exactly who's your enemy. The American public is not your enemy. The American society is not your enemy. It's not your opposition. The 37 organizations with these individuals, these are individuals that are having a structural animosity toward you. They are less than 1.00% of the American public. They are able to speak to a large audience because Fox News and other modes of communication are giving them that ability. So don't take the marketing to be a substitute for what the American society is about. That's one. Second, you need to be more engaged than what they want you to be not engaged. You need to be more engaged, more out, speak, organize, and get involved with your Islamic characteristics and identity. Don't feel keeping your Islam in a locked cabin and say, I'm going to come out just to speak about how me and you like the birds together. That does not change, because you need to change and alter the epistemological structure that is formulating the mindset, and that has to be, you have to come with your identity as a Muslim and say, here's what I believe, here's what my perspective, and let's actually improve the society together. Increase your civic engagement. Volunteer in as many civic areas as possible, in hospitals, in libraries, in public spaces, in your council members. Every place that you could be a person of involvement, be there. And lastly, double your effort in political campaigns. Participating in politics does not mean to conspire with the wrong politics. You have to be the Yusuf of your time at the court of the Pharaoh. You still act as a just person regardless of the circumstances, and that's what you need to do, and that's what you need to undertake in order to challenge and reverse this Islamophobic campaign that is directed against you. And at the core of this is essentially all of these spokespeople for Islamophobia are trying to protect Israel's interest, and what you need is to say, no, Israel's interest is not the same as the US interest or our Muslim society in this country. Jazakumullah khair, and I'll take your questions.
Do we have any questions? There's also index cards. You can write your questions on them if you like and pass them to the front.
While we're waiting for questions, we also have the Islamophobia Studies Journal. It's the only journal about Islamophobia in any place in the world that is dedicated to the study of Islamophobia in a systematic way. So we have some of those are available.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I was wondering if you could comment on the role of Arabists in Islamophobia, the Western person who went but is living in Doha and speaks a little bit of Arabic and is suddenly an expert on Yemen, Egypt, Palestine, and all, you know, and every other Arab country. What their role in Islamophobia is.
Well, there's at this period, for example, let's say in Stanford, there's this person that went to Iraq during the Iraq invasion, spent 6 months in Iraq. Mostly, he was only in the green zone. When he came back now, he's a specialist about democratization in the Arab world. Right? In the green zone, did not leave the green zone in Iraq, which basically spoke English with everybody. Maybe the only Arab in there is the person that they had there in the rendition program that possibly was subject to torture. Right? So he comes back, and all of a sudden he's able to give his perspective about democratization in the Muslim world. My answer is that if that's the criteria, then pilots should be the experts, because they visit all the countries, right? And because they land in the airport, they stay in the Hilton, right, in Doha and other, and they could come and give us about the country. That's a problem where individuals, because they're from the northern hemisphere, US and Europe, as soon as they visit the East, the Arab world, the Muslim world, or immediately relegate to themselves the authority to represent, because they already have latent Orientalism, latent Islamophobia in their mind, and therefore when they come to speak out of certainty. And then they generalize and project about their experiences and on. Sometimes they had, bad experiences, and that's legitimate, but limit your experience to the experience that you had, and don't generalize. You visited Doha, you don't know anything about Egypt, you don't know anything about Morocco, don't speak about Afghanistan being part of the Arab world, right? And what you get is a large number of these individuals, because of their position of power, they are able to project. The lighter skin you are, the more you're able to be on TV. So all of a sudden, just because they're able to string two sentences together about this place, and they sprinkle it with few Arab words, and immediately they become the specialists. Just because they're able to say falafel correctly, all of a sudden they are able to give us the philosophical underpinning of Islam and the Muslim world. So we just have to challenge that.
More reactionary to what's happening in the American society. How much research or effort is done to propagate the thoughts of Islam as a world, a world religion or a world system? Because they, for the last 20 years, they have been talking about Islam as capitalism versus Islam as the thinking that took place instead of communism. How much Muslims are doing research in the Western universities and think tanks to show the world what Islam is as a thought?
Well, that's the field of Islamic studies, and we could look at a number of researchers that are doing work about Islam. Most of those who are engaged in research in Islam, for the most part, have really done some great work on history of Islam, parts of Islamic history. We're not dealing here with individuals who are specialists in Islam. All these are specialists in being demagogues and in racism and discrimination. There are some great works on Islam in general in Western academia, and you could point to a variety of those individuals and a number of those who write. Hayya ala salah.
Hayya ala salah.
Hey, Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you, Dr. Hatem.
Just an announcement, we have the AMP convention, so we want to make sure that to see every one of you in the AMP convention during the Thanksgiving week, inshallah. And then tonight we have the rally.
Right across the street, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
If you could please turn in your surveys and also help put the chairs back, and inshallah we'll see you November 2nd.